Hey everybody, John Fenn with part 2 here about why church in the house. And I asked the question before part 1 and made the statement that most people will say it's because of persecution. And so I brought out the fact that the first house church that God himself invented was the Garden of Eden, meeting with Adam and Eve there. And he's never left the house. So I concluded in part 1 about the revival movement that happened under the Pharisees and how they initiated meeting on Saturdays in the home and making copies of the Torah, of the Word, and passing it around, having every 10 families, and then they would multiply out and go to different homes and rotate among themselves. So when the day of Pentecost came, they just continued in that tradition that had been there, that means that had been there. They'd always been talking about the Lord in their homes. They'd always gathered in their homes. You know, weddings and funerals and everything else was in the home, and rising and lying down and in and out, talking about the Lord to their children. So the home was always the focus. And so in the New Testament, we have to understand that the apostles were apostles doing church in the home, and they were writing to people doing church in the home. So my horror was that for 25 years, my first 25 years of walking with the Lord, I had pulled my New Testament understanding out of the context of the home and tried to make it work in the auditorium, and it doesn't work. That's why there's so many hurt people, so many unfulfilled people, so many people just, going through the motions. And it answered so many questions for me when I started to put the Word back in context of the home. For instance, when we look at the book of Romans, and 1 Corinthians. Well, we are told in 1 Corinthians in Acts chapter 18, that the first church at Corinthians in verses 8 and 9 met in the home of a guy named Justus. And Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, joined him, as well as many of the Corinthians, many of the Greeks also. But they met in the home of Justus in Corinth. And so when you read 1 and 2 Corinthians, he's writing first and foremost to the house at Justus, and of course they multiplied out beyond that. Paul talks about Gaius, his host. He talks about Chloe. He talks about Phoebe and Centria. He talks about different people like that in the area. When he's writing to the Romans in Romans 16, he mentions Aquila and Priscilla. And Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned 6 times in Scripture. 4 times she comes first. Church history and tradition says that Priscilla was quite the teacher, and that it would be kind of like in our day, maybe a Joyce and Dave Meyer or something like that, where she was the main speaker and he was more behind the scenes, and that was her gifting. So she's mentioned 4 out of the 6 times, but they are mentioned twice of hosting house church in Rome and also in Ephesus. And so when you read Romans and you read the letter to the Ephesians, you're reading letters that went to Aquila and Priscilla's home. And when you read 1 and 2 Corinthians, you're reading letters that went to Justus's home. When you read 1 and 2 Thessalonians, we're told in Acts chapter 17 that it went to Jason and his household. Philippians, the first hostess was Lydia and her household. And you read Colossians, and that was Philemon. We're told in Philemon verse 2. And then there's others. There's a woman named Nymphas in Colossians 4:15 in Laodicea. There's all these churches that are mentioned and all these individuals, and I came to realize that all my New Testament was written to people in the home. And so the understanding of the fivefold ministry is in the home. That's where you're going to find your apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Not in a single house church, but in the connected and related house churches in the local community and in the body locally. Then you're going to see the fivefold bring forth. And then you're also going to see helps and governments and all the other gifts that are mentioned there, the spiritual gifts, the charismatic gifts, the helping gifts, giving and organizing, and all the different things that are mentioned in Romans chapter 12, 1 Corinthians 12, and so on. And so church in the house is the way it's being done. When I started studying this, I looked at the U.S. Center for World Missions and other organizations, and they were documenting that Christianity is the fastest growing religion in the world at 7.7%. Some organizations put 7.8%, who's going to quibble over 0.1%. But over 7% a year. Christianity is growing, and they noted that it's only growing in house church. The traditional auditorium church in the West is just trading sheep. There's not any real growth going on, or very little. It's almost stagnant. And some of the churches that used to be on the cutting edge are actually becoming more like denominations, more structured and more set and not open to the move of the Spirit. And this something falls into place here when you're talking about church in the house and why church in the house and seeing that it went for 300 years. What happened was, and I've got to backtrack a little bit, in 312, 313, 339, all the way through the 300s, first Constantine and then others, legalized Christianity in the Edict of Milan. And the Edict of Milan licensed and legalized Christianity. My wife and I were in Pompeii, Italy, outside of Naples, Italy, viewing the tours of Pompeii, and we came upon a ruined Temple of Apollos. And our tour guide was an archaeologist by degree, and she was telling us a little of the history. And she said that that the temples to Zeus and Apollo became churches after Christianity was legalized. It was like something that I have read and studied and talked about for years and years. And here this archaeologist is telling me the same history, you know, there in Pompeii. And she said this was a temple to Zeus originally. And she said, but you know, throughout Italy and throughout the empire, when Constantine legalized Christianity, he realized that the temple structure served the new Christianity, when calling them out of homes, served them well, which had bench seats, which had a platform, which had a pulpit. And this is a secular archaeologist leading this tour group. She said, and they realized that they had to make one person in charge, and that's where the priest came from. That's where the pastor came from. And that is exactly what happened. For the first 300 years, they met in homes. And so what we went to today, or what we go to today in the auditorium, came about through the legalization of Christianity, and then the kicking out of the priests and priestesses of the pagan temples, and inviting instead Christians in, keeping the same format. So when you go to your church and you're sitting in that pew and you're looking at the platform and you're looking at the pulpit and you're looking at one guy in charge, you're looking at the pattern of the pagan temples. What God invented was the home, and a plurality of leadership by consensus. And I'll talk about elders, I'll talk about leaders in another video. But for right now, that gives you the history in these parts 1 and 2, from Adam and Eve all the way through the legalization of Christianity, and God moving now throughout the world in the home. Statistics vary in China, but I've seen everything from 130 million to 200 million Chinese Christians. I saw a news item as well saying that at current levels, the nation of India will be the largest predominantly Christian nation on the earth by the year 2030. At current levels of growth, by the year 2030, India will be the largest predominantly Christian nation on earth if nothing stops it. Isn't that an amazing thing? And it's all going from house to house. And that's why. All right. Thank you.